like to thank Sangam Talks and Vaishali ji for giving me this opportunity to speak about the works of Pandit Kota Venkatachalam. He was born in 1885 and began his research when he was 23 years old in 1908, which is about 115 years ago. He did extensive research for 40 years, and he kept all his books in manuscript form for 40 years because he was applying a great deal of rigor, reconciling information from multiple sources. And so he kept his books in manuscript form and started publishing them in 1949. And his last book was published in 1957. And went on to become a Shankaracharya of a Sringeri Upapitam. And I have a slide on that, so I will talk about that when we get to that slide. But then he attained Siddhi in 1959 as a Shankaracharya. And his books have been out of print for 70 years. His contributions are immense. He is the first person and probably the only person to have reconstructed Indian chronology from primary Sanskrit sources. So very good. I will share my slides and then provide some commentary as we go along. There are three things I'd like to draw your attention to on this slide. The title, of course, itself is Reconstruction of Indic Chronology from Sruti and Smriti. And the author is Pandit Kota Venkatachalam, who went on to become Shankaracharya of the Sringeri Parampara, and that is an Upapitam or Sringeri located in Hampi. He earned several titles. He was conferred several titles during his lifetime. And the one I would like to highlight today, which is very appropriate, is Bharata, Charitra, Bhaskara. So Bharata is India, of course. And if you look at this picture, it is an effort to symbolize that title. So you see the map of India, which is Bharata, and the rays of this is a rising sun. And if you look at all the rays, each ray has a date that he was able to re-establish through his research. And his picture is in the center, and this symbolizes his title, Bharata Charitra Bhaskara. And I'd also like to draw your attention to the quotation at the bottom of the screen. This quotation is in a book written by Dr. Vepa Khosla. And the book is called The Origins of Astronomy, the Calendar and Time, published by the Indic Studies Foundation in 2011. So Dr. Vepa Khosla is a US-based Indologist who has done extensive amount of research into Indology. He has used Pandit Kota Venkatachalam's research work extensively and has quoted him in many places. And found it fitting to provide this tribute, and I will read it. The quote says, "No history of India would be complete if it does not include the work of Kota Venkatachalam. This great historian of the modern era remains largely unknown in his own native land, despite a record of research and publications that would place him in the category of Will Durant and Arnold Toynbee." So this is the testimony and tribute that Dr. Vepa Khosla paid to Pandit Kota Venkatachalam, and I wanted to draw your attention to that before I began the talk. I have organized my talk into three parts. The first part is about the author himself. It's a brief biography, and we go over things like his methodology and his approach in his research. Section 2 is his Purvapaksha. In other words, he was trying to identify and define the problem to be solved, and that is the Purvapaksha. And the third section is his Uttrapaksha. So having understood the problem that needed to be solved, how did he go about and what does the reconstructed chronology look like? That is his response to the problem. The reconstructed chronology from primary sources is the Uttrapaksha. So this is how I've organized the slide. Today, my plan is to cover parts 1 and 2. Part 3, we will deal with in a follow-on session. So with that said, let us get into the biography of Pandit Kota Venkatachalam. He was born in 1885, and he was a traditional scholar who was well grounded in Sruti and Smriti. And when he was very young, he realized that the textbooks in schools had a lot of distortions in chronology. And he, being well schooled, he began his research at the age of 23. And that was in 1908, 115 years ago. And he continued his research till 1948 for a total of 24 years and published 24 books starting in 1949. And this went on till 1957. And he is a pioneer in reconstructing Bharatiya chronology from ancient texts. And like I said, he has been conferred a number of titles, and I illustrate 3 of them over here. And the one at the very top of that list, Bharata Charitra Bhaskara, is one that I've drawn your attention to, and it is on the cover slide as well. He was initiated as the Shankaracharya by the Mahaswami of Sringeri himself, Sri Chidananda Nrsimha Bharati. There is a picture on the right, and you see Mahaswamiji himself with Pandit Kota Venkatachalam. And after the initiation, he became the Adhipati of the Abhinava Virupaksha Peetham, which is an Upapeetham of Sringeri. And since then, he was known as Jagat Guru Shankaracharya Sri Advayananda Sankara Bharati Swami. Now, the methodology that he used is a multidisciplinary approach. In other words, he used ancient texts, he used astronomy, he used archaeology, inscriptions, and many more sources. He had always felt that ancient texts are the primary evidence. What that means is Puranas and Itihasas are a source of history. There is a popular misconception that Puranas do not have historical information, but he firmly felt that the primary evidence has got to be ancient texts, and yet he was willing to accept prashastis, inscriptions, archaeological findings, and coins to corroborate his findings. And he also drew from traditional legends and folklore. He was an active participant in conferences, and I list over here 3 papers that he presented at conferences at different times. The first one is Sandramis, Sandracotus, and Sandrasiptus, which was presented in 1951 in Jaipur at a conference in Rajputana, as Rajasthan was called back then. In 1953, he presented a paper called The Predetermined Plot in Indian Chronology. The point being that as an avid researcher, he was trying to publish his findings as he completed research and submitted that typically for peer reviews. And that is the last section you see. And he was an active contributor to, in addition to conferences, he was a member of the Andhra Historical Research Society in Rajahmundry. And this research society is actually a clearinghouse where scholars, peer scholars, present their discoveries for peer review. They defend their findings, they defend their assertions, and when challenged, they also refute those disagreements by presenting their own evidence. So I just want to underscore the fact that the methodology was a reliance on ancient texts as primary evidence, but use other sources to corroborate findings in the texts. Now, his approach was to establish the correct sheet anchor first. So what is a sheet anchor? A sheet anchor is a central key date that other important dates depend on. And he felt that to solve this problem and to reconstruct Indian chronology, the sheet anchor, he felt, was the date of the Mahabharata war. And if the date of the Mahabharata war could be established, all the other dates that depend on it could be easily established. So, having established the Mahabharata war, the next step would be to follow genealogies of long lived kingdoms, because there were many kingdoms that existed well before the Mahabharata war, and I list some over here. Hastinapur, Magadha, Ayodhya, Kashmir, and Nepal. All of these existed before the Mahabharata war began. However, Hastinapur did not last too much longer after the war, but Magadha, Ayodhya, Kashmir, and Nepal existed for a lot longer. In fact, Kashmir and Nepal exist even today. So by following genealogies of these long-lived kingdoms, you begin to understand the various kingdoms and the dynasties of rulers that ruled over those kingdoms. And he also felt that Puranas and other chronologies, like the Buddhist and Jain chronicles, are also consistent from the Mahabharata war once this is established. Then the next step would be to correlate across genealogies. So, in other words, you may have dynasties of kings for various kingdoms, but you also want to see who were contemporaneous with the others. And therefore, that required correlating across genealogies and multiple sources. And this had to be corroborated with contemporary literature, with inscriptions, with coins, with prashastis, as well as from foreign sources. The reason is, there are multiple texts that refer to the same historical event. There are multiple texts that refer to historical personalities, and each text provides dates and clues. And it is up to the true historian to look at different sources of information, correlate, and this process is called triangulation. So this reconciliation across multiple sources is called triangulation, and that is a very rigorous approach that Panditji employed in his research. Now, his works provide a complete framework. What I mean by that is, number one, he identifies most distortions in our chronology and textbooks in one place. Number two, he provides a completely reconstructed chronology from primary sources, and the date range is from 3138 BC to 1193 AD. The reason he picked those two dates is because he establishes 3138 BC as the date of the Mahabharata war, and he felt that 1193, which is when Muslim invasions began in India, from that point forward, our history is well documented. So the date range that he was focused on was the date of the Mahabharata war to 1193 AD. Number three, in doing so, he completely reconciles several sources of Itihasa. He looks at the history of Magadha from Puranic sources. He uses the history of Nepal and the history of Kashmir. Now, one thing I would like to say here is that when he was looking at the history of Nepal and the history of Kashmir, he actually found there were distortions in those as well. And so he extended his research to complete the history of Nepal, to correct the history of Nepal, and that is one of the books. He has reconstructed the chronology of Nepal, and another book in which he publishes a reconstructed chronology of Kashmir. He also uses Buddhist and Jain texts because Jain texts provide references to people contemporaneous with Adi Shankaracharya, for example, and Buddhist texts, of course, define the life of Buddha describe the life of Buddha, provide important dates and clues, and these must be reconciled as well as used for triangulation. He also identified distortions in the history of Kashmir, as I had mentioned, in Kalhana's Rajatarangiri, which is the authoritative source of Kashmir history. Specifically, there were four slokas that he identifies, 49, 50, 51, and 54. And he said, a great scholar like Kalhana could not have written these four slokas. There are other scholars who took these slokas at face value, and when they tried to apply them to chronology, they came up with very different answers. Similarly, with the Nepal Rajavamsavali, Persian synchronism is another thing that he introduced. What is synchronism? Synchronism is a way to connect two very different calendars. So the Western calendar and the Hindu calendar are so different that it is not possible to translate a date from one into the other. So what is required is a global event that connects the two calendars. And we'll see an example of this. And the East India Company and the people that made distortions in Indian history actually used Greek synchronism. In other words, the only global event that the Western Indologists could find is Alexander traveling to the east. And the date of Alexander was well known using the Western calendar, but there had to be a way to connect to the Hindu calendar to find his contemporary at the time. So that was Greek synchronism. However, Panditji says Greek synchronism is not appropriate, but what is more appropriate is Persian synchronisms. Now, number four, he identifies all the references required for the reconstruction that he has done. In other words, he identifies the text, he identifies the chapter, and he identifies the sloka. Where this provides a value is even if one were to disagree with his conclusions, all the references have been provided, and therefore an interested scholar could use those references to do one's own parallel and independent research. One of the original findings is out of India migration. He is a pioneer in this topic. In 1940, his book was published in 1949, but the research was done much earlier. And in that, he actually debunks the Aryan invasion theory uh, and provides an alternate theory of migrations out of India. And in fact, I'd like to mention over here the great freedom fighter Bala Gangadhar Tilak had written a book called The Arctic Home of the Aryans. And so Bala Gangadhar Tilakji felt that the North Pole, approximately the Arctic Circle, was the home of the Aryans, and the Aryans invaded India from there. And Panditji actually wrote a complete book rebutting Bala Gangadhar Tilak's book, and I have that on a future slide, and I will get to that in a moment. So now, Puranas as a source of historical information. So there is a misconception that Puranas do not contain historical information, and that is not quite correct. In other words, the word Purana means Purapi Navaha, meaning the old yet ever new. And there are two categories of Puranas. You have the Mahapuranas and you have the Upapuranas. So for a text to be called a Mahapurana, it must meet 10 characteristics called the Dasalakshana. And for a text to be considered an Upapurana, it must meet 5 characteristics called the Panchalakshana. Now, the Panchalakshana are common to both, and they're listed on this slide. They're the Sarga, Pratisarga, Manvantara, Vamsa, and Vamsanacharita. So, Sarga is the section that describes Srishti, provides cosmic units. Now, Pratisarga describes the destruction at the end of Srishti. The Manvantara describes the cosmic units of time. And the last two, Vamsa and Vamsanacharita, provide enough information from which chronologies can be reconstructed. The Vamsa is a section that talks about the genealogies of kings, of Gotras from the founding rishis. The Vamsanacharita is a section that talks about significant personalities and their achievements and events surrounding them in their lifetime. And so the takeaway from this is that chronologies can be reconstructed from Vamsa and Vamsanacharita. So that was a brief introduction to the author, Pandit Kota Venkatachalam. The next section is on the Purvapaksha, studying the problem. What was the problem? Why were there distortions? Who introduced them? What are the distortions? And what were the motivations of the people that introduced those distortions? As far as who introduced the distortion, I provide a small list of names. William Jones, Max Muller, George Bueller, Fleet Purgator. Now you will notice that all of these people were employees of the East India Company. William Jones lived in the 18th century, in the 1750s. Max Muller and everyone else were contemporaries, and they lived about 80 years after William Jones in the 19th century. But the person that began the distortions was William Jones. Now, why he did so is he was a staunch Christian and he was reading Sanskrit texts through a Christian lens. And therefore, since the Bible, the Old Testament, that explains that God created the earth in 6 days, that establishes biblical creation in 4004 BC. So William Jones could not accept an Indian date older than 4004 BC because that contradicted what he believed in as from the Bible. So he arbitrarily decided that Indian history had to start in 2029 BC. This was a very arbitrary decision made by William Jones, and this was the beginning of the problem. People that came after him repeated his assertions and actually tried to provide even more detail to support this thought, this theory, that Indian history started in 2029 BC. So Max Muller, George Bueller, Fleet, all of these people were partners in taking this forward. Now, what did they do? What did William Jones do? He had to shrink and fit Indian history to start in 2029. So what he did was, he said, everything before this current Kali Yuga is fiction. He said, this is the imagination of poets. And so he discarded everything before Kali Yuga. And to shrink the timeline in order to fit the biblical time frame, he removed 1,000 years before the Mahabharata war. He removed 1,200 years after the Mahabharata war. He deliberately dated many events incorrectly. Now, there are texts that corroborate the Puranas, like the Nepal Rajavamsavali that we have talked about, which provides the history of Nepal. He actually shrunk the Nepal Rajavamsavali by 3,400 years. He also made interpolations into the Puranas. And having introduced the interpolations, he would say that this contradicts something else and then claim that they are not reliable and discarded many Puranas in that manner. They also inserted spurious slokas into the Rajatarangini of Kalhana, which is the history of Kashmir. They also made interpolation into texts of other authors to support their own theories. And they relied on very skimpy accounts of foreign travelers to construct Indian history. And I can give you a couple of examples here. The first example is Megasthenes. Megasthenes lived in India for probably 3 or 4 years, but too much importance is relied to is attached to the accounts of Megasthenes, then there are Chinese travelers like Fa Hian and Yuan Sung, who also lived in India for a very short time, but the Western Indologists used those accounts to actually reconstruct Indian chronology. They also forged coins, they forged inscriptions to support their dates, and they actually destroyed genuine evidence. And Max Muller himself created the Aryan race and the Aryan invasion theory. So the takeaway from all of this is in studying the problem, it was philologists of the East India Company that wrote Indian history based on very skimpy and questionable evidence. So, to give you an example, I did mention the word synchronism, and here is the example of Greek synchronism. And again, synchronism is required because the Western calendar and the Hindu calendar are very, very different, and it is not possible to convert a date from one calendar to the other, and therefore we need a global event that connects the two calendars. And once the two calendars are connected, it then becomes easy to traverse up and down one calendar or the other. So that is synchronism, and they used Greek synchronism. In other words, they used the event of Alexander traveling east. So when Alexander traveled east in 327 BC, he did not enter India. He was actually defeated near the Sindhu River, and he actually was trying to return to Macedonia, but actually died on the way. His general Seleucus then sent an ambassador to India whose name was Megasthenes. And Megasthenes had an entourage. He had people who would chronicle everything that he did. Uh, Now, that compilation was a book called Indica. Now, this book called Indica has never been found, has never been seen, but 200 and 400 years after Alexander, in the first, second centuries BC and 200 AD, there were historians called Arrian and Strabo. Now, Arrian and Strabo wrote commentaries on the book called Indica, supposedly written by Megasthenes' entourage. Even those books are not to be found. But in the 19th century, surprisingly, a Western Indologist by the name of McCrindle actually publishes a book that he claims is Indica as described by Megasthenes. So in that book, he finds three names, but let's step back and take a moment to understand the source that this was based on. The source is a book written in the 19th century, and that book is a commentary on commentaries by Arrian and Strabo in the first, second century BC and 200 AD of travels of Alexander in the 4th century BC. So if you look at the time span, one would wonder as to how accurate this could be and how this could be the basis for constructing Indian history. But nevertheless, this is the evidence that William Jones used to establish Chandragupta Maurya as the contemporary of Alexander in 327 BC. Now, what names did they find? They found that there were three names: Sandrames, Sandracotus, and Sandrasiptus. And these three names found in Indica were the names of rulers that succeeded one another. Sandrames ruled first, followed by Sandracotus, and Sandracotus was followed by Sandrasiptus. So now the question is, these are Greek versions of Indian names. So in looking at Indian chronicles, we find that the name in the middle, Sandracotus, closely matches Chandragupta. And in looking for Chandraguptas, we find that there are two Chandraguptas in Indian history. There is one of the Maurya dynasty, and there is one of the Gupta dynasty. If you look at Sandrasiptus, you'll notice that Sandrasiptus resembles Samudragupta more closely than it resembles Bindusara. And Sandrames resembles Chandramas more closely than it resembles Mahapadmananda. In other words, all the evidence is pointing to the Gupta dynasty of 327 BC, who was the true contemporary of Alexander. Yet, because Indian history had to start in 2029 BC, William Jones mapped Alexander to Chandragupta of the Maurya dynasty. Now, the truth is that the Maurya dynasty and Chandragupta Maurya lived in 1534 BC, almost 1200 years before Alexander. But by making Chandragupta Maurya the contemporary of Alexander, William Jones pulled Indian history forward by 1200 years. And because he had a goal to meet, that Indian history could not start before 2029. So he had to tamper with the dates and he had to doctor the dates to fit a biblical timeline. So this is how William Jones introduced Greek synchronism and distorted Indian history by making Chandragupta Maurya the contemporary of Alexander. The Andhra Satavahanas were moved from 833 BC to 220 BC. And like I said, all these historical personalities like Buddha, Chandragupta Maurya, Patanjali, Adi Shankara were all moved forward by 1200 years. Now, the Sungas, Kanvas, and the Andhras, they ruled Magadha one after the other. But what William Jones did was he made them contemporaries to shrink the timeline. The Gupta kings were moved. Now, the Gupta kings were the contemporaries of Alexander. So 327, it was Chandragupta of the Gupta dynasty who was the true contemporary of Alexander, but they were moved to the 4th century AD. The great astronomer Varahamihira, you will find, if you look at Wikipedia, Wikipedia will tell you Varahamihira existed in 505 AD. This is a distortion. He actually lived around the 1st century BC. William Jones also removed Vikramaditya, Salivahana, and 4 Agnivamsa dynasties from Indian history. He just wiped them out. That was about 1300 years that he shrank to make this fit a biblical time frame. But the side effect was he removed the Agnivamsa dynasties and he removed Vikramaditya and Salivahana totally from Indian history. And this is amazing because Vikramaditya and Salivahana were at the time William Jones made his distortion in 1750. Vikramaditya and Salivahana were still in India's civilizational memory. Vikramaditya has a calendar after him, named after him. It's the Vikram Samvat. The Vikram Samvat calendar is in use even today. And if you look at Hindu calendars today, you will also find mention of the Salivahana Saka. So there is a calendar established after Salivahana, and these were Chakravartis who had calendars established in their names, and yet they were removed from history altogether. So, in looking at this in summary, what Panditji says is he has 8 types of criticisms of Western Indologists. And he said, number 1, they are misreading the evidence. They are forging evidence to make their point and strengthen their case. They're misinterpreting data. They are destroying evidence, misrepresenting evidence. They actually rejected some genuine evidence as spurious. They were misapplying the evidence that they found, and they were ignoring some genuine inscriptions. So these are the 8 types of criticisms that Panditji levels against the Western Indologists. So this, in a nutshell, is the study of the problem. So we know what the distortions are, we know who did them, and we know their motivations. But in doing this, look at the number of sources that distortions were introduced into. So, looking at this, Panditji concluded that it was not going to be easy to correct each text individually. And therefore, what he did was he started clean from the beginning and reconstructed Indian chronology entirely from Sruti and Smriti. And on the next slide, I have tried to list some of his books. You'll find uh, the history of creation. So this is about Srishti. So because the biblical timeline is that the universe was created in 4004 BC, and so to refute that, Panditji thought the first two books were necessary. The first one talks about Srishti itself and the age of the universe that we will get into detail when we go to the Uttrapaksha, which will not be today, but in the follow-on webinar. But the first two books over here in 1949 deal with the beginning of Srishti and then the genesis of the human race, how the human race first appeared and how it migrated and filled different parts of the globe. In 1951, he wrote a book dedicated to Vikramaditya and Salivahana and provides evidence that they were real historical personalities, that they truly existed, and that they were not fictitious like William Jones claimed. 1953, he wrote a book called The Plot in Indian Chronology. And in this book, he tries to summarize and provide an overview of all the books that he has written. 1953 is also the year when he wrote the Chronology of Nepal History Reconstructed. So there were distortions. He found distortions in the Nepal Rajavamsavali, and having corrected those, he published another book, which is the Reconstructed History of Nepal, followed by a Reconstructed History of Kashmir. 1956, he deals with the topic of Buddha, of Milinda, Antiyoga, and the Yoga Purana. So the Yoga Purana, people have considered Purana. Panditji provides his opinion about the Yoga Purana. Milinda, Antiyoga are also historical personalities that have been confused, and confusion has been spread about who they are and when they existed. And Panditji provides evidence of Milinda and Amtiyoka about when they lived, in what time frames they lived, and where geographically they lived. 1956, he published this book called Indian Eras. And this is important because the dates in ancient times were not represented using the Common Era calendar nor the Christian calendar, because this was well before Christ. So we have to understand how dates were actually represented in India, and we have different eras. So if you look at eras of the recent times, there was a calendar that was started at the end of the Mahabharata war when Yudhishthira becomes the Chakravarti of Bharatavarsha. There is a calendar that started then called the Yudhishthira Saka. There is a calendar that was started at the beginning of Kali Yuga, which is called the Kali era. Then there were other calendars, and then of course you have the Vikram Samvat, you have the Shalivahana Saka, and so all of these are described in this book called Indian Eras, published in 1956. Now, Chronology of Ancient Hindu History, number 1 and number 2, were published in 1957. In fact, Chronology of Ancient Hindu History in 1957 was the last book that he published, in which he mentions that he is about to retire, and he encourages Indologists after him to continue this research work. It's called An Appeal to Young Indologists. 1957, The Age of the Mahabharata War was actually published posthumously by his sons. And then, of course, we have towards the end of the slide, we have all the books he wrote in Telugu. Everything I have talked about so far are books that he wrote in English, and the Telugu books are Who Are the Andhra Kings? So he had a book on the Andhra kings. He had a book on the Gupta kings. He had a book on the time period of Ashoka. And then he talks about the dynasties of kings in Kali Yuga. the origin of Andhra kings, and then he has 3 books about the Kali era itself. And what I had mentioned earlier, this is the book he wrote as a rebuttal to Balagangadhar Tilak's book, Andhra Aryula Dhruva Nivasa Khandanamu. This is in Telugu. What it means, it translates to a criticism of the Arctic home of the Aryans. So in this book, he is actually providing a rebuttal to Balagangadhar Tilak and is asserting that there was no Aryan invasion, that the Arctic is not the home of the Aryans, the migrations were out of India, and he was proposing an out of India theory. And then, of course, he talks about the Agni dynasty. The Agni dynasty meaning Vikramaditya and Salivahana. This is a book that goes into the detail of the entire dynasty. And the book that we saw towards the top of this list is about Vikramaditya and Salivahana solely. So that then provides a brief biography of the author, and the second section that I just covered provides a definition of the problem that needs to be solved. That is the Purvapaksha. What is the problem that needs to be solved?
Sir, I am Dr. Neena Bansal. So thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And I am really indebted to you for this very amazing presentation. And I am Dr. Neena Bansal. I'm teaching in one of the colleges of University of Delhi. I'm teaching in Kamala Nehru College. Although I belong to political science discipline, but for many years, I am more interested towards history. And very recently, like 3-4 months back, I was given an assignment to work on ancient Kashmir, which was also my area of interest. So I accidentally bumped into this book by Kota Venkatachalam ji. Although I could not make the full sense of it, but I felt that this is some book which is a treasure to me. So, and when I saw this mail, I was so happy that, I have to attend this lecture. And this is just beyond my words. So I have a few questions, sir. One is that, you talked about this out of India migration, a book about this, which was written by Kota ji. Is it in English or in?
No, it is in Telugu.
Telugu. Okay.
It's in Telugu, and it's out of print. I mean, all his books have been out of print for 70 years. We are just beginning to reprint all of them. So we're working on the English books first. There are 12 English books. We have published 6 books that are available now. I'm actually proofreading Nepal and Kashmir right now. The book on Nepal and the book on Kashmir. So that's 7 and 8. So we've got 6 books that are published and are available. We hope that the book on Nepal history and the book on Kashmir history will be going to the publisher soon.
So, sir, another question is that since I'm working on Kalana's history of Kashmir, so you talked about shlokas 49, 50, 59, and 54. Am I right? Which are distorted.
Yes.
When did these distortions take place? Like, and what is the original book of Kalhan, and where do we find it? And where are these distortions where you can see that these are not in the original text and they are there in these texts?
It has been a long time. I mean, Panditji did his research more than 100 years ago. Even in those times, he found versions of Puranas with distortions in them, as an example. Say, in 1908, about 115 years when he began his research, he had a small set of books at home. That was his reference material. When he needed more reference material than that, he had to go to state libraries. And state libraries were where they had authoritative references, but you could not check them out. So these were reference materials, so you had to sit there and take notes. And all of this was before the telephones, it was before the internet, it was before Google, it was before PDFs and copy paste functions. So this was in times where it was very difficult to actually get authoritative information. And that is why it took him 40 years to do his research. So by the same token, most of these big libraries did have reference material, including Rajatarangini by Kalhana. And as he was going through that, yes, he did find, because those slokas, if you believe those slokas, those slokas assert that the Pandavas were alive 653 years after the Kali Yuga began. If you believe those slokas, then they assert that the Pandavas were alive 653 years after Kali Yuga started, which is not true. Because Kali Yuga is the Niryana of Sri Krishna. It is the end of the Dwapar Yuga and the beginning of Kali Yuga. And it is the Niryana of Sri Krishna, that is when Yudhishthira gives up his throne, makes Parikshit the king of Hastinapur, and goes into the forest, and his Swargarohana is 24 years later. So Yudhishthira Swargarohana, and then his brothers followed, or actually preceded him. Yudhishthira was the last one to ascend to heaven, and his Swargarohana was in 2076 BC. But if you believe these three spurious slokas in Rajatarangini, you will conclude that he was alive in Kali 653. Now, there are historians, there are scholars such as Rao Bahadur P.V. Kane, Bharat Ratna. Rao Bahadur P.V. Kane believed them to be correct, and he did not realize that they were distorted. And he came up with the date of Mahabharata in 2448 BC, which is very different from what Panditji comes up with, which is 3138 BC. So I hope that answers your question.
So that means to say that the story that is mentioned in Rastarangi Kalana about Krishna going to Kashmir and then having that is wrong.
Krishna going to Kashmir?
Krishna going and fighting a battle with Gonandvan and then killing him and then coronating his wife as the queen. This is all.
Well, here's what happened. Yes, what happened is at the time of the Mahabharata war, the Pandavas and the Kauravas. Now you have to remember, Yudhishthira performs the Ashwamedha Yaga and Rajasuya Yagam after he built Indraprastha, which is well before the Mahabharata war. So when he does the Ashwamedha Yaga at Indraprastha, he becomes a Chakravarti. He becomes a Chakravarti back then, but at Indraprastha. And so when there is a war between the Chakravarti and his cousin, all the kings, the Samanta kings in Bharatavarsha took sides. They participated in the war. Because they were a Samanta on one side or the other. So all of them fought either for the Kauravas or for the Pandavas. And at that time, the king of Kashmir had died, and his son was 13 years old, and he was not considered. See, even back then, there were principles to warfare. And part of those principles were that the king had to be an adult, well, able-bodied adult who was trained to fight. And therefore, on those grounds, Kashmir was not allowed to participate in the Mahabharata war.
Yes, yes. Sir, this story is, can I take a reference of the story? Ye to galat nahi hai na. This is a fine story. This is a right story.
It is a fact. It is a fact.
It's a
now,
fact.
if you take Magadha, for example, you take Magadha. Jarasandh was the king of Magadha, and he is killed before the war by Bhima. Right? Jarasandh is killed by Bhima before the war, and after that, Yudhishthira does the Rajasuya Yagam, the Ashwamedha Yaga to become a Chakravarti. And the war happens much later. So during the war, the son of Jarasandha, whose name I believe was Sahadeva, fights in the Mahabharata war, and he's actually killed in the Mahabharata war. So if you look at contemporaneous dynasties, in fact, yeah, so the king of Kashmir, Gonanda, did not fight.
Mhm.
The king
Yeah.
of Kashmir did not participate in the war itself. So Kalhana's Rajatarangani is accurate, but more importantly than that are the Tarangas, where you have the dynasties and the kings of each dynasty that ruled Kashmir. So because the topic is chronology, not history. So that's why Panditji does not go into history, because he was tightly focused on establishing the chronology, the timeline.
Yes.
Right? So that's the focus.
Thanks. Sir, one last question. Sir, lately I am also working on a project which is a ICHR project, and it's about the new Parliament building. And so I am researching on the ancient wisdom of Shilpa Shastra and the modern architecture. So while reading on this very recently, like yesterday, day before yesterday, I came across a book by Dr. V. Ganapati, and he's talking of not 4 Vedas, but 5 Vedas. And the first Veda he's talking of as the Pranav Veda. And he's also talking, so I just wanted to, because this I heard for the first time and I read for the first time. So I just wanted to your take, and like, is it somewhere near to the
No,
actuality or not?
no, I mean, that may be a personal opinion, but that's not the consensus view of scholars, nor of Dharma gurus. There are 4 Vedas. There are times where the Mahabharata is referred to as the fifth Veda.
Oh,
So they're not saying it is a Veda, but they refer to it sometimes as the Panchama Veda. So the Mahabharata is occasionally referred to as the fifth Veda, but I've not heard of the one that you've mentioned, and nor do I think it is the consensus opinion of scholars.
okay. So they say this is about basically the Shilpa Shastra and the Sthapatya Veda.
No,
So
Shastras have existed. Shilpa Shastra does exist, but I don't believe that that's in the category of Vedas. See,
Veda.
see, Sruti and Smriti. See, Smriti is that which is revealed. So it is not man-made. It is revealed to man. That
Yes.
is Smriti. Sruti. That is Sruti. And then, so when you Smriti is man-made, which are the Shastras. So Shilpa Shastra is written by a human being. The Vedas are not written by human beings.
They're downloaded.
No, well, yeah, downloaded mentally
Yeah.
to those people who are intellectually evolved enough to receive them.
Yes, yes, sir. I meant that only. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir.
My interest area is really philosophy and psychology. And I am 83 years old, and I started doing my research since I was 4 years old.
I see.
Okay. Now, I always want, I'm a very lazy person. Okay. I have a hard time reading, because if I have a question, whom do I ask the question? And my life experience is that I was punished many, many times just for asking the question. Okay. I'm just giving my background for the question. So my question is that why there is so much of interest in reading history? What is the output of that? To me, unless they say what is the output and it is useful for the basic need of human beings, okay, it does not serve any purpose. So really, so that way I want to see the history, that what is the evolution process. Is there, can you suggest to me some very, just a very, very simple chronology of history, known history best? But when we say known, then again, there are differences. You know, this is right, this is wrong. As far as I'm concerned, 99% of the things which we are taught in school they are totally wrong.
Right.
Okay. So, okay, can you guide me a little bit here?
Well, so I don't know that I could name a specific book, but I tried to answer your question. I think the first question you asked was, why is history important? And what does it do or help to help a civilization? I think was your first question. So
Right.
maybe I can try to respond to that. In the matter that I have, in the material that I have just presented to you, you can see that Indian history was written by Western philologists. So the point is, unless we know our history, then our identity is given to us by people who study us, people who rule over us.
You are absolutely right. And
Right.
I actually know how it all took place. My method of study was I have gone around the world, okay, all 7 continents, including Antarctica and Arctic Circle, okay, everywhere, Africa, South America, and so on. I can go on and list everywhere, and I'm still traveling, okay. And I have gone to villages and see what the history is. You see, so I know exactly what you are saying, okay.
Right. So the point is that the Britishers were the colonizers, and they colonized us. Now,
well, not only Britishers, the whole of Europe, and to me, they are the stronger people, and emperors and so on, all through the history. Okay, they have ruled because they did not want to earn essentially emotion, what we call vasana, to
no,
satisfy that vasana.
that's true.
Yeah,
But
so
the impact on the Indian civilization is that over time
yeah,
we became
yeah.
intellectually colonized, and
Uh-huh.
we had to learn about ourselves by reading books that they wrote.
Okay.
So the impact of letting someone else declare the narrative and set the narrative is
Right,
that,
right.
yes, we see when we want to learn about Indian history, we don't go to traditional texts. We go to books written by Englishmen. And there we are fed what the English people think. So they think that their past should be our future.